Welcome back for part 4 of our tube frame chassis build. I didn't quite get all the parts that I wanted this week. There's some delays in shipping, like the tubing that I ordered for building lower control arms is somehow in Canada after coming from Ohio. The spindles need the ball joint tapers reamed. The lowers we're converting from a 7 degree to a 10 degree. It's a little bit larger diameter, helps have some more strength in there. This one's pretty easy. All I gotta do is just blend the taper out. The length is pretty good, and that's easily done with a drill. The uppers are 7 degrees still, however, the ball joint is a larger diameter, so they're not in deep enough. Also need to make a seal spacer. These AFX spindles have a smaller diameter seal on the back than the G-body stuff does. The G-body stuff is a better seal design, so I want to make a spacer. It goes on the spindle. Whip that up real quick in the lathe. It was pretty easy to do. They just go on with a light press tap fit. Alright, with the spindle mocked up right now, I know that I'm going to end up with a pivot point on this lower control arm that's around 7 1/4 from the ground. With our lower control arm chassis side point from the ground, once this goes down to a 4-inch ride height, is going to be 8 1/8. So we have 7/8 of an inch up to the chassis. I was kind of targeting 2-inch, which would be super easy, actually be more if this was the ride height. To be able to tune around that though, I have the window because I have the adjustability of up and down 1/2 inch on the chassis side that's going to be built in. This is the standard length lower ball joint. I know for sure there's a plus 1/2 inch, and I think there's even a longer one than that. I can't remember if it's 3/4 or 1 inch, something like that. So I have tunability here. I went with the shorter one just to try to keep my bump steer geometry working okay, because when that steering arm comes forward, it's got to try to match this lower ball joint, and it ends up really close to the wheel barrel. Also don't have a ton of angle in this upper control arm right now compared to what the ball joint cup is at for an 11 degree angle, and again, that's because this chassis is going to go down. That's going to get a little bit better. So really with this angle sitting here, that's at about 1.5 inch droop compared to what ride height's going to be, or right about there anyway. But we've still got tons of room without maxing out that ball joint. Ready to start putting on the front suspension mount points. I have my rear front plates with the integrated bolt holes for mounting the front plate off of the engine. And we got this window in here for putting some weld on this cross member, and this is just weight relief. I had to grind a little bit of clearance here for the weld that we've got on the side already, and it can fit up nice and tight. Alright, I had to double check the chassis. It was sitting on all the blocks the way I wanted it. I had to do just a little bit of sanding on the bottom edge for this frame rail. It didn't quite fit square. And I needed a little bit of a height difference there to make these match. So I was able to get them, they're probably within a 1/16 of an inch now. This edge is just a little bit below and it's a little bit more on this side, but I'm not about to start trying to chase that as far as a reference point, because there might be just ever so slight of a difference in the length of the cross member on each side. I mean, we're talking maybe a 1/16 of an inch, which, if you remember, the goal has been try to be within a 1/16 on everything as we go. The front frame rails are higher here right now than they are out at the ends by about 1/4 of an inch. I'm not going to try to deal with that right now because I know that, I mean, I have these to weld and I've got the other gussets underneath on the cross member. However, we do have the upper control arm mounts to weld on here, and that's going to be a lot of heat and a lot of shrink up here on top. So I'm thinking that by the time I'm done adding those on, these front frame rails are probably going to be pretty darn close to level. And I'd rather just anticipate that we're going to get there versus try to level it out now only to weld them on later and have to try to bend them back the other way again. Trying to set the next mount for the lower control arm. I ended up having to get this spaced and then saw that it was bigger top and bottom because this plate after welding was kind of like that. So a few hits with the hammer and we got that straightened out where it's a lot more even the whole way. Pretty happy with where it's at. I'll be able to weld this in both sides. I don't know if this is dumb, brilliant, or both, but trying to make sure, like how I laid this out to begin with, is that your steering lines up with both pivots. I have marks down here at the bottom of the frame, but they're not really lining up with what I've got for parts here now. Just in forward and backwards positioning. I was thinking maybe the rack isn't exactly where it was before, and I really don't have any way to guarantee that it is. I mean, it could be, it gotta be close anyway. But I know the rack doesn't move because I got the hydraulics blocked off, so it's just a matter of it being in the same position. But what I should do is, if the rack is centered, I should measure frame to frame. That would be the better way to do this and make sure. 4 5/8. 4 5/8, so yeah, okay. Well, that's pretty good for eyeballing it because there is some slotted motion on the rack. Alright, well then this is what I'm going to go with. The point here is that this string is pulling off the center of the bolt. It crosses the center of this bolt, which is going to be the center of our pivot at exactly the center. And then I'll use the string to position the rear bracket. Basically, get it lined up like so. And then I know that my pivots will be all in line with the steering. I'm ending up a little bit farther back than I originally thought, but that's okay. I'm more than happy to do that because the farther back I get, I'm actually going to grind the corner of this a little bit so I can start overlapping this joint here and get a couple more planes involved to make it stronger. Might even do a gusset afterwards, but we'll see how this comes out. I think I need to try to position my spring so that it's not touching when I'm trying to line this up, because that will influence it possibly back and forth by over 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to see what I can do there. If it ain't perfect, it's close.
You can see we can just follow that string right through that pivot point, through the center of that one, right to our steering.
This should be a way that the geometry is going to work out where we can have as close to zero bump steer as possible, or at least making it a lot closer and easier to get low bump steer right off the bat. So how this is affecting bump steer is we're going to line it up, our pivot points, the lower control arm pivot points with the steering pivot point, and then all we have to do is line up the outer tie rod pivot point with the lower ball joint pivot point, and then they're going to swing on the same arc when the steering wheel is pointed straight. The hard part is when the rack ends up being a different height. Usually you need to get the rack in between the lower and the upper pivot points, but then it takes a lot more adjustment to try to find how good you can actually get it, and it just turns into a lot of variables that makes it difficult. But by doing this, we're taking the time to do this now, it's going to pretty much guarantee that we're going to be in a very, very close window for our bump steer. Anybody want to guess how much the front end warped from welding in all the suspension points? Now, I've already checked it, and from here to the front of the cross member, everything stayed about the same. But up to the nose of the chassis, we have lost ½ inch. Now, it was down about ¼ inch before, so really all of that only changed it about ¼ inch. The big one is the frame rails across, because we're at 29 1/16 there. And up here we are 28 7/16 maybe, and it was 29 before. So that sucker pulled in ½ inch. It's quite a bit. I'm not going to worry about the pulled in part. Like I said before, once we weld on the upper control arm mounts, I'm pretty sure that's going to pull these back up, so I'm not too worried about those yet. And as far as the front being pulled in, I do have the sway bar that's still got to go in up here. That's going to have a tube that's spanning across. I can easily just spread the front of the frame rails out until they're the right size before I weld that in too, and that'll help stabilize everything. Today I want to keep moving along with the front suspension. I still don't have material for the lower control arms, so I'm going to work on what I can do and start with the uppers, which I think is fine anyway because they're a fixed length versus I can build the lowers to whatever I want, so that can be kind of the last thing. I did the math as far as just planning for 6 degrees of caster right off the bat. Where that is for axle center line versus the two ball joints, because the lower will be forward of axle center line and the upper will be to the rear of axle center line. I've got axle center line marked here. I got a sheet over there that's got that number written down on it. I got to mark that out on these parts yet. And then we'll just shift center line of the upper control arm mount that much to the rear. That way we're going to have adjustment for additional and for less. I'm not exactly sure what that window is, but it should be a few degrees in either direction. I had originally planned on putting these mounts right in the center of this tube. However, I think I'm going to be pushing it to the rear or inside edge of the tube and putting the gusset on the front side. This gives me room to do like I did on the other car where the control arm is mounted to the outside, and have the ability to seal this off in the future as far as the whole wheel well is concerned. It makes it a lot easier versus If I put it in the middle and the control arm is to the back, then we're running into, okay, how do we build sheet metal to seal all of this off? So this will simplify things a bit. We're also going to need to think about our coilover mount at some point in the future, which can easily be added in where it acts kind of as a gusset between the frame rail, the upper mount, and even out to the fender, which kind of like build our box for sealing off the wheel well in the future. So I verified with the scale, got our axle center line, the center line of the mount, that I had the same measurement, which is just under 27 3/8 from the front frame rail to the leading edge on both sides. So this allows me to grind and clean off all of the scale and surface rust here before welding them on, but I needed to verify that I had a good measurement from the front or anywhere else really, but the front's the easiest one to use and it matches, because when I grind all that off I'm going to lose my axle center line. And just to be safe, I marked it down the side here too, but that's not going to do me a lot of good for trying to position that on top. Also worth noting when doing a project like this and you're welding some things in and then you have a little interference, take the time to grind that stuff out, because I mean I got just a little bit of weld past and it's not letting me get flush, and I would like this to be flush, so I'm going to take the time, grind that little bit top of the weld off. It doesn't seem like much, but I mean like the cross member here yesterday, I had to clearance behind here a little bit for the weld that was already on the cross member, and just taking the time to do that stuff to make sure everything fits as snug and tight as possible is really gonna make a better product in the end. I will cut this bar back out. It's purely just to keep them from twisting out since there's more weld to the outside. Not that it would matter a whole lot, I just wanted to try to hold them as vertical as possible.